Rome, 44 BCE. The Senate hall sweltered under a grey, heavy sky. Whispers slithered through the marble corridors. Julius Caesar had returned from war not just a hero, but a man to be feared. The Republic, once governed by collective rule, now bent under the shadow of one man. At first, it was only a handful: Cassius, Casca, and a few bitter senators. But as Caesar's power swelled, so did the fear. More joined: Decimus, Trebonius, Ligarius. Some came out of loyalty to the Republic, others out of jealousy or self-preservation, but all agreed Caesar had to die. Brutus was the key. With him, the plot would gain legitimacy. Without him, it would be seen as a power grab. Cassius pressed harder, sending anonymous letters in different handwriting, begging Brutus to awake Rome and strike for liberty. Brutus hesitated. Then came the moment of no return. Caesar was offered a crown during the Lupercalia festival. He refused it 3 times, but many believed it was only for show. Rome buzzed with rumor, a king in everything but name. That night, Brutus gave in. He met the conspirators in darkness. No togas, no titles, just men with grim faces and cold resolve. There, under torchlight and olive branches, they took an oath. No one would betray the plan, and no one would back out. It was decided. On the Ides of March, March 15th, Julius Caesar would die in the very heart of Rome. Blood soaked the marble. Caesar lay motionless, his toga clinging to his cooling body. Around him, the killers stood in a daze, breathing hard, blades dripping, their faces pale. There was no celebration. The weight of what they had done pressed down like a stone. For all their talk of liberty, none had prepared for the horror of the act itself, not even Brutus. He stared at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. The Senate chamber emptied fast. No mobs cheered in the streets. No crowds hailed the rebirth of the Republic. Only stunned whispers. They killed Caesar. They killed Caesar. Mark Antony, who had been detained outside, fled. He knew what came next was not justice, but chaos. The conspirators marched through Rome shouting, "Liberty! Liberty!" But the people did not rise with them. They stayed in their homes, afraid, confused. Caesar had been beloved by the masses. He'd fed them, entertained them, fought for them. Now their protector was dead, and no one filled the void. The city did not rejoice, it held its breath. The conspirators had won the Senate, but had they lost the people? Brutus and Cassius had expected applause. Instead, they got fire. The people of Rome, enraged by Antony's funeral speech and Caesar's generosity, turned violent. The streets filled with mobs chanting his name. Fires spread, stones flew at senators' homes. The killers, once proud defenders of liberty, now fled like criminals. Cassius escaped first, gathering supporters and slipping out of Rome under cover of darkness. Brutus followed, slower, haunted by what he had done, confused by the fury that followed what he believed was justice. Both men headed east, toward the provinces, where they hoped to rally legions and reclaim control. But their message, "We saved the Republic," rang hollow in the wake of Caesar's murder. In Rome, Mark Antony seized the moment. He branded the conspirators as traitors, called for their arrest, and rallied Caesar's veterans to his banner. But he wasn't alone in his ambitions. A new figure had arrived, young Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son and heir. Barely 18, but already dangerous. As Brutus and Cassius plotted their next move, they didn't yet know. Rome was no longer theirs. And 2 men, Antony and Octavian, were about to reshape the world Caesar left behind. Caesar stumbled backward, blood already darkening his robes. He looked around, not with anger, but disbelief. Friends, allies, men he had elevated now drove their knives into him like butchers. Then he saw him. Brutus. Not hiding, not resisting. His eyes met Caesar's as he stepped forward, blade in hand. The room seemed to freeze. Caesar, bleeding and betrayed, uttered the most haunting words ever recorded in Roman history. Et tu, Brute. You too, Brutus. It was not a curse, it was heartbreak. And with those words, something inside Caesar broke. He no longer resisted. He pulled his toga over his head, not out of fear, but out of shame. Brutus struck. The final blow. Caesar collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue, the very man he had defeated in civil war, now stained with the conqueror's blood, irony carved deep, 23 stab wounds in total. The silence afterward was unbearable. The Senate chamber, once echoing with ambition and steel, now pulsed with stunned quiet. No cheers, no triumph, just the slow, creeping awareness. They had killed not just a man, but the future of Rome. The Republic had won, so they thought. For hours, Caesar's body lay untouched. No guards moved him, no priests came. The theatre of Pompey, once the heart of Roman politics, had become a tomb. Senators vanished into side streets, afraid of what they had done, and even more afraid of what would come. Finally, a few loyal servants came. Silently, they lifted his lifeless form, wrapped in bloodied cloth, and carried him home. Rome's people began to gather. They had loved Caesar, not the senators, not the aristocrats, him. He gave them land, wheat, and spectacle. He promised them glory, made them feel part of something great. Now he was gone, murdered by men in robes. Rumors spread quickly that his last words cursed Brutus, that his ghost would haunt the city, that the gods had already punished the murderers with a black sun and trembling earth. Superstition gripped the streets, but it was not fear that would erupt next. It was rage. Mark Antony waited, quietly, carefully. He wasn't done. And Caesar's death wasn't the end of tyranny. It was the beginning of revenge. In February of 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was officially declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. To some, it seemed the natural reward for a man who had brought stability after civil war. To others, it was a declaration of monarchy in everything but name. Caesar, dressed in purple, sat on a golden throne during Senate sessions and allowed his image to be stamped on coins, acts once reserved for gods and kings. The old guard of the Republic watched in silent horror. Was Rome still a republic, or already a kingdom? Brutus, descendant of the man who overthrew Rome's last king, wrestled with a growing unease. Caesar had spared his life after the civil war, had even treated him like a son, but that same kindness now weighed like chains. Cassius, bitter and calculating, pressed the question, would you rather be a slave under one man, or free among equals? The Senate debated, but fear clamped their tongues. Caesar's power was too vast, his popularity too great. Behind columns and closed doors, a plot began to form, not from enemies, but from those closest to him. A dagger, they believed, could still save the Republic. The year was 42 BCE. Two massive armies prepared to clash in the northern plains of Greece, near the city of Philippi. On one side, Brutus and Cassius, commanding the Eastern legions, battle-hardened and well-funded. On the other, Antony and Octavian, marching under the banner of vengeance for Caesar. It was not just a battle, it was the final chapter of the Republic. Antony took charge in the field. Octavian, ill and inexperienced in war, remained in camp, his authority now more political than martial. Still, his presence mattered. He bore Caesar's name, and that alone inspired loyalty. Brutus and Cassius built strong defensive positions, hoping to starve out the enemy, but Antony outmaneuvered them, cutting through swamps, building causeways, attacking where they least expected. The first clash was brutal. Brutus's forces pushed back Octavian's lines, even capturing his camp. Meanwhile, Cassius's troops collapsed under Antony's assault. Mistakenly believing Brutus had also failed, Cassius took his own life, falling on his sword. Brutus wept for his friend, but had no time to mourn. The second battle loomed, and the fate of Rome stood on the edge of a blade. Mark Antony had served Caesar loyally for years, on battlefields and in the Senate. Now, with Caesar dead, Antony saw what the conspirators did not. They had murdered a symbol, not just a man, and symbols don't die so easily. Antony didn't act rashly. He stayed calm. Publicly, he supported peace. He met with Brutus and Cassius, even offered friendship. In private, though, he prepared. He requested to deliver Caesar's funeral oration. The conspirators agreed, believing Antony would maintain order, but Antony had a different plan. He would turn the people. He studied the will. Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen, parks to the public, and land to veterans. Antony saw the power in that paper. Caesar, even in death, had given more to the people than the Senate ever had. As the funeral pyre was built in the Forum, Antony sharpened his words like a sword. He would not call for war, but he would plant the seed of vengeance deep in the heart of the crowd. The Senate had spilled blood. Now Rome itself would decide who truly ruled. And Antony was ready to unleash the storm. While Rome drowned in blood and fear, Brutus and Cassius built their own empire in the east. They raised legions in Greece and Asia Minor, funded by forced tributes and seized treasuries. Cities once loyal to Caesar were now bled dry to support the cause of liberty. Yet even among their allies, doubt simmered. Were these men saviors, or just new tyrants in disguise? Brutus tried to hold the moral high ground. He issued coins with slogans about freedom and the Republic. But every coin paid for a soldier's loyalty, not virtue. Cassius, more cynical, focused on logistics, arms, ships, and silver. They knew time was running out. The second triumvirate was preparing to march. Antony and Octavian, despite their rivalry, now turned their combined might eastward. They weren't just chasing traitors, they were chasing revenge. Two forces, each believing they fought for Rome's future, now hurtled toward the greatest civil war of the ancient world. The field would not be the Senate, it would be blood-soaked soil, and only one vision of Rome would survive. The ghosts of Caesar, Pompey, and the Republic marched with them. In 30 BCE, Octavian marched into Egypt. No army dared resist him. Antony, broken and disgraced, heard false news that Cleopatra was dead. In despair, he fell on his sword. As he lay dying, he learned the truth. She was alive. Carried to her chamber, he died in her arms, whispering her name. Cleopatra knew what Octavian would do: parade her through Rome in chains. She would not give him that satisfaction. She adorned herself in royal robes, retreated to her tomb, and, according to legend, let an asp, a venomous snake, bite her. Whether by poison or snake, the queen died as she had lived, on her own terms. Octavian entered Alexandria and claimed all. He ordered Caesar's only biological son, Caesarion, to be killed. Too many Caesars, he said coldly. With no rivals left, Octavian returned to Rome, a god in all but name. In 27 BCE, the Senate named him Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic, born centuries earlier in defiance of kings, had ended not with a vote, but with a dagger. What began with the murder of one man ended with the birth of an empire, and Julius Caesar, dead but never gone, had shaped it all. 20 days after Cassius fell, the armies met again, the Second Battle of Philippi. Brutus, though shaken, rallied his men with stoic calm. He still believed in his cause, that tyranny could not outlive virtue, but his forces were weary. Morale had crumbled with Cassius's death, supplies ran low, and Antony pressed every advantage. This time, there was no mistake. Antony's legions broke through Brutus's right flank. Panic spread, Brutus's troops scattered. He tried to regroup, shouting commands above the roar of battle, but the line was already folding. By sunset, the field was soaked with blood, and Brutus stood on a lonely hill surrounded by a few loyal followers. Defeated, he turned to them and said calmly, "It is not that I fear death, but that I grieve for Rome." Then he fell upon his sword, the same way Cassius had. His last words, "Caesar, now be still. I killed not thee with half so good a will." With Brutus's death, the dream of the Republic died with him. The men who had once sworn to save Rome had vanished into legend, cut down by the very future they'd tried to prevent. To the people of Rome, Marcus Junius Brutus was a symbol of virtue, noble, philosophical, and loyal. To Julius Caesar, he was practically family. Caesar once said, "If anything were to happen to me, I would rather it be at the hands of Brutus." But Brutus's blood carried a legacy. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had driven out Rome's last king centuries earlier, founding the Republic. That legacy whispered in his ear as Caesar claimed absolute power. Brutus was torn. He admired Caesar. He owed him his life, his position, his status. But he feared what Caesar might become, a tyrant cloaked in the robe of a reformer. Cassius knew this. He preyed on Brutus's guilt and pride, fanning the flame. "What would your ancestors say?" he whispered. Would they kneel? At night, Brutus walked alone through the forum, passing statues of Rome's founders. In their silent stone eyes, he saw judgment. Could one man's death restore liberty, or was it betrayal? The line between patriot and murderer blurred. Brutus didn't know it yet, but his name would echo through history as either a savior of the Republic or its greatest traitor. 20 days after Cassius fell, the armies met again, the Second Battle of Philippi. Brutus, though shaken, rallied his men with stoic calm. He still believed in his cause, that tyranny could not outlive virtue, but his forces were weary. Morale had crumbled with Cassius's death, supplies ran low, and Antony pressed every advantage. This time, there was no mistake. Antony's legions broke through Brutus's right flank. Panic spread, Brutus's troops scattered. He tried to regroup, shouting commands above the roar of battle, but the line was already folding. By sunset, the field was soaked with blood, and Brutus stood on a lonely hill surrounded by a few loyal followers. Defeated, he turned to them and said calmly, "It is not that I fear death, but that I grieve for Rome." Then he fell upon his sword, the same way Cassius had. His last words, "Caesar, now be still. I killed not thee with half so good a will." With Brutus's death, the dream of the Republic died with him. The men who had once sworn to save Rome had vanished into legend, cut down by the very future they'd tried to prevent. To the people of Rome, Marcus Junius Brutus was a symbol of virtue, noble, philosophical, and loyal. To Julius Caesar, he was practically family. Caesar once said, "If anything were to happen to me, I would rather it be at the hands of Brutus." But Brutus's blood carried a legacy. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had driven out Rome's last king centuries earlier, founding the Republic. That legacy whispered in his ear as Caesar claimed absolute power. Brutus was torn. He admired Caesar. He owed him his life, his position, his status. But he feared what Caesar might become, a tyrant cloaked in the robe of a reformer. Cassius knew this. He preyed on Brutus's guilt and pride, fanning the flame. "What would your ancestors say?" he whispered. Would they kneel? At night, Brutus walked alone through the Forum, passing statues of Rome's founders. In their silent stone eyes, he saw judgment. Could one man's death restore liberty, or was it betrayal? The line between patriot and murderer blurred. Brutus didn't know it yet, but his name would echo through history as either a savior of the Republic or its greatest traitor. The Senate had convened not in its usual location, but at the Theatre of Pompey. An odd choice, but one that suited the conspirators perfectly. It offered tight corridors, limited guards, and above all, control. As Caesar arrived, a wave of senators greeted him with rehearsed warmth. Smiles stretched too wide, eyes darted nervously. Each man touched his robe, where his blade lay hidden. Trebonius took Mark Antony aside, distracting Caesar's loyal general with casual talk, ensuring he wouldn't interfere. Caesar entered the chamber. At its center stood his golden chair. The conspirators closed in like wolves, positioning themselves as if by chance. Tilius Cimber approached with a petition to recall his exiled brother. Caesar refused. Cimber pressed again. Caesar waved him off. Then, without warning, Cimber seized Caesar's toga and yanked it down from his shoulders. It had begun. Casca struck first, clumsy, wild. "Villain, what are you doing?" Caesar cried, stunned. More blades flashed. Steel pierced flesh. The senators, Rome's elite, turned frenzied, each wanting to be part of history, part of the killing. Among them stood Brutus. His dagger, still clean, trembled in his hand. He had a choice to make. Now, Philippi ended the war, but not the tension. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the Senate's last defenders were gone. Antony and Octavian stood victorious, but uneasy allies. Their smiles were forced, their trust paper-thin. Both knew Rome was too small for two Caesars. Octavian returned to Rome, hailed as a hero. He was no longer the sickly boy who claimed a name. He was now a man of power, draped in military glory. The Senate, weak and submissive, handed him more honors, more titles. He accepted them with quiet calculation. Antony, meanwhile, drifted east. He took up with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, forming a power base in Alexandria. His critics whispered, he's becoming an Eastern king, not a Roman. The alliance that had avenged Caesar now began to unravel. But for the moment, Rome belonged to the victors. Statues of Caesar rose again. His birthday was celebrated. His image became divine. The man stabbed 23 times had not been erased. He had been resurrected as a god. And though his killers lay in foreign graves, their legacy would soon be erased from memory. A new war brewed on the horizon, and the final transformation of Rome had just begun. In the east, Mark Antony shed his Roman armor and wrapped himself in Egyptian silk. He lived in Alexandria, not Rome, at the side of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, Caesar's former lover and mother to his only biological son. Their union was passionate, political, and dangerous. To Antony, Cleopatra offered wealth, ships, and loyalty. To Cleopatra, Antony offered legitimacy and protection. Together, they declared their children rulers of Eastern territories, a direct insult to Roman sovereignty. In Rome, Octavian seized the moment. He launched a propaganda war, accusing Antony of abandoning Roman values, of groveling before a foreign queen, of betraying Caesar's legacy. He read Antony's will aloud in the Senate, revealing that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. It worked. Public opinion turned. The Senate declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, painting the conflict as Rome versus the East. But everyone knew the truth. It was Caesar's heir versus Caesar's general. One last war would decide who ruled the Roman world. And Octavian was no longer playing politics. He was preparing for total domination. The year was 31 BCE. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Agrippa, cornered Antony and Cleopatra near the Greek coast at Actium. It wasn't just a battle, it was the climax of 20 years of betrayal, ambition, and war born from Caesar's murder. Antony's forces were trapped between sea and shore. His ships were heavier, stronger, but slower. Octavian's navy was smaller but more maneuverable, striking like a swarm of bees. As the sea battle raged, something unexpected happened. Cleopatra's fleet suddenly turned and fled, sails raised. Antony, in shock, followed her, abandoning his men, his commanders, and the fight. Without leadership, his navy collapsed. Octavian had won. But it wasn't just a military victory, it was a political masterpiece. Rome now saw Antony not as a hero, but as a traitor bewitched by a foreign queen. Octavian returned to Rome draped in triumph. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. They knew what came next. The age of rivals was over. The age of emperors had begun. Only one chapter remained: death and a crown. He'd crossed the Rubicon, defied the Senate, crowned himself dictator for life. But not all bowed in silence. Cassius watched Caesar's triumph with clenched teeth. Brutus, a friend yet torn, questioned his loyalty not to Caesar but to Rome itself. Whispers grew louder. Is Caesar a savior or a tyrant? At the heart of Rome, a conspiracy formed like storm clouds, quiet, calculating, deadly, and then came the prophecy. "Beware the Ides of March," warned a blind soothsayer as Caesar passed, brushing him off with a smug smile. March 15th was just another day to him, but in that moment, something shifted. Rome's fate now hung on the blade's edge, not in battlefields, but in whispers, dreams, and sharpened daggers. He ruled with unmatched power, but would die with 23 wounds. This is not just the story of Caesar's fall. This is how friends became murderers, and how history changed forever. The second triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, was not forged in unity, but in mutual need. Their first act as absolute rulers was not reform or rebuilding, it was extermination. They drafted lists, prescriptions of men marked for death, senators, generals, orators, even distant relatives of Caesar's enemies. Wealthy or influential, it didn't matter. Their assets were seized, their blood spilled. Rome descended into fear. One name stunned the public: Cicero. The great orator, once Caesar's critic and the Republic's voice, was hunted down. Octavian, despite Cicero's earlier support, allowed his inclusion. Loyalty meant nothing now, only power. Cicero tried to flee. He was captured on the road. His hands, the ones that wrote speeches, and his tongue were severed and nailed to the rostra in the forum. A warning to all: no voice shall rise against the triumvirate. Friends turned in friends. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. The city's soul withered under terror and silence. Brutus and Cassius, watching from the east, now saw what their act had unleashed. The Republic was not reborn after Caesar. It was burned, gutted, and worn as a mask by those who now ruled in his name. And the reckoning was still to come. Rome teetered between chaos and control. Mark Antony, commanding legions and loyalty, tightened his grip. Octavian, Caesar's heir, gained momentum with charm, gold, and a famous name. The Senate, fearing Antony's ambition, tried to use Octavian to curb him, arming the boy in hopes he'd be their weapon. But Octavian had no intention of being anyone's pawn. In 43 BCE, Antony clashed with the Senate's forces near Mutina. Octavian fought alongside them, but not for them. When the Senate's 2 consuls died in battle, Octavian suddenly held command of the only effective army in Italy. Then he made his move. Marching on Rome, Octavian demanded the consulship. The Senate, helpless, surrendered. The teenager now held a title once earned by the greats. But he wasn't finished. In a stunning reversal, Octavian reached out to his rival, Antony, and to Marcus Lepidus, another powerful general. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship of 3 men. They swore to avenge Caesar. And then came the proscriptions. Enemies of Caesar, real or imagined, were listed for death. Wealth was seized. Blood ran in Rome's streets once again. The Republic had no saviors left, only rulers with unfinished vengeance.